politics that really would be hard to pigeonhole in the traditional left-right dialogue that we usually use when we talk about politics. Now, this puts them directly at odds with the Washington establishment, including elected Democrats and including journalists who might otherwise be their philosophical allies. So it's actually incorrect to think of bloggers as being aligned with people we might see in the traditional press or consider to be liberal, or who themselves might consider to be liberal. They might consider themselves to be liberal. That does not make them allies, because the Netroots are engaged in a power struggle, often with some of those very same individuals. It's not about ideology, it's about power. Now, how it plays out, we still don't know. This is a work in progress. But if they're successful, we will see a difference in our politics. If they're successful, we will see a transformation in the way our politics is done. One of the things they're pushing up against is the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom is what we also often see if you're a political junkie and you watch the Sunday talk shows. You're familiar with the conventional wisdom. Towards the end of Meet the Press, or this week, there'll be a round table, and journalists will sit around the round table and they'll talk about what's going to happen in Washington, what's happening in Washington. Now, the Netroots will push back against this conventional wisdom. They regard it, first of all, as flawed. They regard it as out of touch. They regard it as a reflection of what's happening among the Beltway elite, but they regard the Beltway elite itself as being out of touch with what's going on outside of Washington. And remember, the Netroots take place everywhere. And so I want to show you an example of the kind of conventional wisdom that Netroots activists are battling. And I think in looking at this, we'll get a sense of how they view this power struggle. This quote up here on the screen is an exchange that took place a couple of weeks ago on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. And it's about healthcare, and in particular, whether or not there's going to be a public option in whatever healthcare legislation comes out of Congress. Here, Cokie Roberts, and there is no greater representative of inside the Beltway wisdom than Cokie. Cokie Roberts is talking to George Stephanopoulos about the public option, and she says, quote, "The liberals do feel like Obama's going to do a bill, he's going to get behind it, and he's out there doing this campaign stuff." And Stephanopoulos says, "And because of that, they're willing to give up the public option?" Cokie Roberts, "Some of them will and some of them won't, but they're going to have to. I mean, it's just a dead issue as far as the Senate is concerned. I mean, Senator Landrieu, who opposes a public option, is representative of 15 Democratic senators. Do the math. I mean, if you have 15 Democratic senators who say that, you don't get to 50 votes. So Cokie Roberts is insisting that the public option is simply a dead issue. Online, you'll see an entirely different take. I'm going to show you a blog post from Daily Kos, which is the largest political blog. And it's a post written on the same day that this exchange was broadcast on television by Jed Lewison, September 13th. Lewison writes, "I still think we can win this fight. And if we do win the fight, we'll not only help pass into law a good popular idea, but we'll also turn on its head the political calculus that in the end progressives, and particularly progressives in Congress, will always cave. Unless progressives in Congress actually demonstrate they have a spine on this issue, no one will ever take them seriously, nor should they. But if progressives in Congress do put up a fight, if they show the decades-old political calculus needs to be upended, then they will have won a major victory that goes beyond the issue at hand. The public option should be passed on its own merits. It's good policy, and it's got popular support. There's 60 Democrats in the Senate and an overwhelming majority in the House. On the face of it, passing the public option should be about the easiest no-brainer in politics, but it's not. And that fact poses a real test for progressives and a real opportunity. Progressives can finally change the power dynamics, note that, the power dynamics in Congress, by proving they will hold their ground. Getting the public option would be one kind of victory, but proving that progressives are a potent political force would be another. And that really, in a nutshell, is what the Netroots are all about. And the potential for that victory is one of the most important reasons that the public option matters so much. We can't give up the fight. How likely is it that they're going to win this battle? Can they turn a set of entrenched political dynamics upside down? Well, we can look to history, we can look to distant history, recent history, to try to answer that question. Let's go all the way back. Let's go all the way back first. And let's look at what happens when new media technology are introduced to politics. Because we have several examples of this from our history. And what we find in each case is that when a new media technology comes online, ultimately there is a political transformation, but not right away. Sometimes it takes a while. It doesn't happen until an individual or a group of individuals figures out what's different about this new medium and unlocks the political potential of that medium and puts it to work for them. Only then do we see a new medium contributing to dramatic political change. It's happened several times in our history. In the 1820s, Andrew Jackson faced a situation in many ways not unlike what Netroots activists face today. The presidential selection system was patronage-based. It was run by a small congressional elite, and Jackson was positioned as an outsider. He wasn't part of the club. Now, printing costs, back then it was all about newspapers, printing costs had been falling for years. So the idea that there was inexpensive printing technology around was not really new. But what Jackson did was he took advantage of inexpensive printing technology at a time when growing suffrage was making the vote available to more people, and he put together a rudimentary campaign network drawing on lots of small newspapers scattered around the country that served as the basis for the first mass-based presidential campaign. And he was successful. Now again, this was the era of the party-controlled press. So in that regard, having newspapers that were partisan, that's what you had. This was nothing new. It was the norm. But Jackson was the first one to use inexpensive newspaper, inexpensive printing technology for campaign management, coordinating communication among his supporters, generating excitement among his base, organizing and mobilizing voters. Nobody had thought to use the technology that way before. Take a look at Lincoln in 1860 and his use of the telegraph. Again, the telegraph was not new. It had been around since the 1840s. It was the first truly mass medium of communication. It made it possible for information to travel simultaneously to all parts of the country. It served as the basis for what we still call the wire services, which were cooperatives where newspaper reporters got together and they basically sold their stories to newspapers that couldn't afford their own reporters and sent those stories out along the telegraph or the wire. So that's why it was called the wire service. That was around for a very long period of time. But along comes Abraham Lincoln. And what Lincoln did was he recognized that he could put this not so new but still relatively different technology to use for his own political purposes. Lincoln served at a time, unlike Jackson, when partisan newspapers were gone. So Lincoln did not have the opportunity to try to put together a network of partisan newspapers like Jackson did. But what Lincoln understood, that nobody before his time understood, was, was that for a president to be successful under these circumstances where you can't control what's written in the press, the president needs to manage the news. And operating as he was under the emergency conditions of the Civil War, he went out to find a way to control the message so that the message that people got in their Associated Press wire stories was the message that he wanted them to have. And the methods he used would look very familiar to people who operate in the television age, because what did he do? He curried favor among reporters. He rewarded his favorites. He made sure that the news was presented, that when he would selectively leak stories for publication, or news for publication, that it was done in a manner that ultimately would reflect what he wanted communicated. Now, other presidents, again, had had access to the telegraph, but Lincoln unlocked its political potential by recognizing how to control the medium in order to manage his message. Let's move into the 20th century. Franklin Roosevelt and radio. Again, Franklin Roosevelt was not the first president to go on the radio. His three immediate predecessors all appeared on the radio. In fact, Calvin Coolidge was actually quite good at it. He was a fairly popular radio personality, something that Actually, when I was reading about that, that struck me as odd because his reputation is that he never said anything. He was silent Cal, but he actually it turns out was quite popular on the radio. But Coolidge, Hoover, Harding, they didn't use the radio in a transformational way the way Franklin Roosevelt did. They used the radio in what at the time was a fairly conventional way for presidents. They would make speeches on the radio. And that's what a president did. So they would make formal addresses. Lots of people got to hear those addresses, but nothing else changed. What Roosevelt understood was the political potential of radio rests in its ability to manufacture intimacy. Radio can create really false intimacy with people if you know how to do it. So Roosevelt spoke to his audience, not over their heads. Roosevelt spoke in colloquial, familiar language. He called his listener my friends. Presidents had never done that before. And it was very deliberate, it was very carefully designed, and it enabled Roosevelt to form a bond with the public. At the height of the Depression, movie theaters would close if Roosevelt was going to be giving a fireside chat because they knew that not enough people would show up to see the movie. So they just didn't bother showing the movie. Roosevelt understood that the political power of radio rests in this ability to create a bond with the public by generating a sense of intimacy if you're aware of it and if you know how to do it. Nixon and television. Nixon and television? What about Kennedy and television? Kennedy was the telegenic one. Kennedy was the one that was born to be on television. What about Dwight Eisenhower? You know, Dwight Eisenhower was the first president to actually hire ad agencies to put together television campaign for him in the 1952 election. He was really the first president to campaign on television. When jet travel was introduced towards the end of his second term, his media people said, this is a great opportunity. We're going to send you around the world. We'll see these great pictures coming back to the United States of you meeting with world leaders. It's just great. And it was. And I mean, it worked really well on television. But none of that has to do with the transformational power of television, which is to create an image of something that maybe isn't really there. You see, what Nixon did in 1968 is he wanted to be president. He had run in 1960, and he lost. He ran for governor of California in 1962, and he was defeated. He famously gave a press conference where he said to reporters, whom he never liked, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. By 1968, he had changed his mind. He wanted to be president, but in the parlance of today's politics, he had very high negatives. People didn't like him, they didn't trust him, and you have to pass a basic threshold level of support if people are going to vote for you. Nixon needed to change that. He surrounded himself with very savvy television people who created the new Nixon. And that's what it was. It was the new Nixon, back and better than ever. What was the new Nixon like? Open, engaging, somebody that you could feel comfortable with. How did he create the new Nixon? By being closed and controlled, by running his campaign from a television studio. That's how you do it on television. You see, the secret of television is people believe the pictures, and if you're good at manipulating the pictures, then you're going to communicate effectively on television. Richard Nixon understood that. There really was no new Nixon. Watergate sort of demonstrated that. Nixon still remained closeted and closed and secretive. But his people, his media people, understood that if you do it right, if you put together a television campaign that convinces people using pictures that in fact you are open and accessible, you can be successful. That's the transformational power of television. And it really wasn't until the late 1960s that this was demonstrated at the national level. Since then, both Republicans and Democrats have been either doing this or attempting to do the same, because that's what television politics is all about. So where does the internet fit into this? Well, the internet, just like these previous technological innovations, is still fairly new, not as new as it was a few years ago, but still fairly new. And what we're seeing is that over the last few years, the left, really more than the right, has begun to figure out what makes the internet potentially transformational. And the key is that the political power of the internet rests with its open source structure. Open source is actually a software term. Think Wikipedia, where anybody, just about anybody, can contribute to it. There are some rules and restrictions. But what open source is all about is the idea that if many individuals contribute their expertise, their distinct perspective on things, their knowledge, to a final product, then that product can be refined by other people, it can be changed by other people, but the sum total of this collaborative effort will be a robust product, whether that product is software or a news story, whatever it may be. The internet is designed, the architecture of the internet is designed to facilitate this kind of collaborative effort. Unlike television, the internet is decentralized. You know, if you look at the other media we were just talking about, they're all centralizing media. The telegraph brought the country together. The radio did the same thing. Television is designed so 1 billion people can watch the same transmission of the Super Bowl at the same time. The internet doesn't work like that. It's the first mass medium, it's still a mass medium, it's the first mass medium that's a decentralized medium. If I asked every one of you, what websites do you go to? I'm sure there'd be some commonalities. Lots of people use Google, YouTube. But beyond that, we would end up with, I would venture to say, a different pattern of internet use for everybody. It's a decentralized medium. It's an interactive medium. We know that. We understand interaction on the web very well. It's a collaborative medium. If you can interact with people, you can collaborate with people. The open source structure of the internet invites this collaboration. Jerome Armstrong, one of the earlier Netroots bloggers, refers to this as the power of many. The idea that many minds, many eyes, looking at the same question, the same problem, working through the same problem, will come up with a more robust approach to that problem than any large or small number of individuals working in isolation. That's the power of the internet. That's the potential that the internet holds. But in order to achieve it, it requires turning political or traditional politics on its head. Because politics traditionally is top-down. It's centralized. It's about command and control. So, you know, anybody who's ever been involved in a political campaign recognizes this. It's all about command and control. In order to tap into the power of the internet, you have to be able to relinquish that at least to a point, because open source politics is decentralized. It's horizontal. And by horizontal, think networks, think links from website to website. It's horizontally connected. And it has to be accessible to everyone, which means everyone and anyone can come and join this community. So point here is that even if you're aware of how the internet functions best politically, you still have to be able to make it happen. And that means relinquishing some degree of control. That is the hallmark of conventional politics. That's not an easy thing to do. So recognizing it is half the battle. Implementing it is the other half of the battle. You need to recognize what makes the internet different, and you need to be able to implement it effectively. Just with these other technologies, same way as with these other technologies that we just talked about, you have to be able to do both. We can say that open source not only describes the architecture of the internet, it also describes the way the Netroots perform their three most important functions in a collaborative way. And they are mobilizing for political action, reporting the news, and building community. The way the Netroots seek to transform politics is through each of these three objectives: to recruit candidates, raise money, mobilize people to vote, to act, to win elections, to push against conventional ways that the news is framed in the mass media, and by building community. These are the three things, and we'll talk a little bit about these as we go along. But the thing to keep in mind, which is a point I was starting to make a little earlier, is that the left is better situated than the right to achieve these goals, because the left is structured in a way that allows it to be better able to take advantage of the open source structure of the internet. What I have up here on the screen is a diagram of the progressive blogosphere, and the way the progressive blogosphere is organized. And the key is that it's horizontal. There are many blogs. It's very difficult when you start to try to define which blogs are progressive blogs. Well, there are several very heavily read national blogs. There are a lot of state blogs. There are special interest blogs. There are local blogs. So it tends to be somewhat amorphous, but blogs link to other blogs. So you can think of this network organized horizontally. And you could also think that this network of blogs is also organized horizontally in conjunction with organizations that are designed for progressive political action, some of which you may have heard of, like MoveOn.org, Democracy for America, Act Blue, which is about raising money for progressive candidates. These are organizations with a presence online that are heavily linked in horizontally to the progressive blogs. And this says community blogs, and that's important too. What makes a blog a community blog is that anybody can post to it. If you wanted to, you could write a diary and post it to a community blog. And then you could comment on that diary. And then you can comment on her comment, and so forth. So it begins a discussion, and it engages people. And it's the fact that the left is largely structured this way. If you look at the high-traffic blogs on the left, they're all community blogs. They all invite community, and that has enabled the left blogosphere to grow over the last few years. This horizontal structure is ideal for mobilizing people for political action. The right is not organized that way. But a lot of what's going on really happened as much by chance as anything. It's really as much a function of opportunity more than it's a function of design or intent. I don't think you can contend that the left blogosphere set out to do it this way. I think it's more accurate to say that there were really very few other structures in place on the left to compete with the internet at a time when the blogosphere began to develop. But on the right, that wasn't the case. On the right, there were a number of other structures in place. And over time, the right blogosphere has developed in concert with these other structures, so that it's part of a more vertically organized structure. You have a very successful presence of conservative voices on talk radio, on cable television. You have tremendous message discipline among conservative office holders who say some of the same things that you see on conservative television programs, on cable TV, and that you hear on conservative talk radio programs. The right blogosphere has, over time, become a part of this larger vertical structure. It's also the case, very significantly, that the top-level conservative blogs are not community blogs. They do not have the capacity for comments. They don't invite anybody to post a diary. And as a consequence of that, they're not really well designed for community building purposes. However, they're ideal, this vertical structure is ideal for message amplification, which is something that conservatives have excelled in and were particularly effective at, and were unchallenged at during the period of television politics, which I would date up until really just a few years ago. Now, the progressive blogosphere is neither particularly ideological nor particularly extremist. I said earlier that it's often portrayed that way in the popular press. There are a number of theories as to why it's viewed this way. One of them very well may be that it has its origins in anti-war activity from several years ago. The very early Netroots began really in opposition to the Bush policies in Iraq at a time when those policies were widely popular. And I think that may have fueled the perception early on that this is a left-wing group, sort of out of touch with mainstream thought. Some progressive bloggers would contend that as the war became unpopular, they were simply ahead of their time. But either way, I think in terms of the way this is perceived, the reputation may in part come from there. It's also the case that a lot of what passes for dialogue online is pretty rude and pretty boisterous. This is still the Wild West of mass media, and people say it as they see it, and there is no censorship on how people express themselves, and in many cases there's just very little self-censorship. So it's easy to confuse the way things are being said with what's being said, but those are different. In terms of content, there's really no ideological orthodoxy. There's no ideological litmus test to blog. And I think the best evidence of this would be if you looked at any progressive weblog during the Democratic presidential campaign season over the last, going back, where are we now? A little over a year ago now. You had some really heated, passionate exchanges between Obama supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters and John Edwards supporters, and there was a draft Gore movement and others as well too. Dennis Kucinich had supporters, and a lot of these folks went after each other. So they would differ, and you will have some of the same differences expressed on other things, on policy objectives. What unites them, really, is the desire to reform the political process. They're looking to change the way politics is done. It's process-oriented. It's not ideologically driven so much as it's process-oriented. They're an elite movement. What this slide says is the Netroots are an elite movement. They are a small group, both by traditional mass media standards, by television standards, and in absolute terms, they're a small group. That small group can be understood as an elite that is using this medium, where the medium, it really magnifies the force of individual voices and allows this small group to be effective, even though they are small, even though they're still maturing. The ability of the internet to magnify the power of their voices, the power of many, is what enables this small elite group to have an outsized effect on our politics. It is, I'm quoting now Chris Bowers, who is a blogger at the blog MyDD. He has coined them, or has coined Netroots bloggers, uses the phrase a bourgeois elite. And I think that's an apt phrase. I haven't heard a better phrase to describe what's going on in the internet left. Basically, these are folks with day jobs, for the most part. This is a self-appointed group of activists who decided that this matters to them, and they want to make a difference. And they are challenging what they regard as the political class in Washington, the professionals, the people who are professional lobbyists, professional politicians, or in their eyes, the worst of that group, the professional politicians who become professional lobbyists. They are, as an elite, a group looking to generate change from the inside. So if you're starting to think about some of these terms, elite, small group, trying to generate change from the inside, this is an entirely different type of politics than what we are used to with television politics, which is a mass-based politics because it's a centralizing mass medium. This is an entirely different type of politics. Their goal, several goals: replace existing elites with those who share their open source approach to politics, establish links among candidates and officials and voters, so it would be voters to candidates, voters to officials, to create a politics of engagement. And they believe that progressive policies would follow from these progressive processes. So they seek to ultimately change policy by changing politics. Because of that, the Netroots oppose the Democratic Party establishment as strongly as they oppose Republican Party politics. They see the Democratic Party as something of a bloated aristocracy. They believe that Democrats have calculated, and in their view incorrectly, that they really are sometimes better off not standing up for their beliefs because to the Netroots, what they see establishment Democrats doing all too often is simply not standing up for what they believe in. And the Iraq War is a good example of this, where you had a lot of Democrats, elected officials, congressmen, senators, who opposed the Iraq War, and who would have told you that off the record. But when it came to vote, they voted for it because they made the calculation that, well, they're up for re-election soon, and they don't want to be cast by their opponents as weak on defense, so they better support the war. Probably the most famous of these is Hillary Clinton, who was skewered for that by some in the Netroots when she was running for president. Meaningful oversight after 2006. When the Democrats won back Congress in 2006, there was an initial sense among some on the internet left that now that the Democrats control Congress, they have real oversight capability, and they're going to investigate what they believed were some of the abuses of the Bush years, abuses of civil liberties, questions about torture, whether torture was used, questions about whether or not the intelligence leading up to the Iraq War was intentionally fixed, but that didn't happen. Those investigations didn't happen, and the reasons as perceived in the Netroots, the reason why they believe this didn't happen was they perceived this as being strategic, that Democrats just made a strategic decision that if they did these things, they would end up galvanizing Republicans. And why galvanize Republicans when they're currently dejected? Don't do it. They would be cast as partisan. They'd have to go on television and defend themselves all the time about being partisan. So they made a strategic decision not to do it. Now, on the Netroots, they say, no, that's the wrong strategy. This is the wrong strategy. Basically, what you want to do is you want to stand up for what you believe. They would contend that if Democrats had stood up and voiced their opposition to the Iraq War when they could have, that history would have been different, and they contend that Democrats ultimately would have been rewarded for that by the public. And they say, you know, it's wrong. It's actually good policy follows from good politics, and good politics follows from pursuing what you believe in. And then sometimes they'll observe that, you know, part of what makes this bureaucracy, this aristocracy rather, entrenched in Washington is that they don't even care sometimes if they win or lose. If you lose your seat in Congress, you can go on to become a lobbyist. You can do very well. It's a small closed system. It reinforces itself. And they object to it, and they're pushing against it to try to get it to change. They have disagreements with the president. And I think this is an important point because Barack Obama was the first national politician to wage an effective online campaign, and he did it beautifully. He was the first individual to figure out how to merge the new medium with the old medium, television, and win. And that was no small trick. But there has always been daylight between the Netroots and the Obama people, both in the campaign and now in the White House. And there are any number of places where the Netroots will push back against what they see coming out of the White House if they believe that what Obama is doing is in line with what they consider to be the old politics, the politics of the Washington aristocracy. So, for instance, a whole list of things on health care reform. Is Obama really sincere about putting his weight behind a public option? Anytime there's evidence that suggests that maybe they're not, we see a tremendous pushback by the Netroots. The possibility that the administration might increase the troop size in Afghanistan. There's pushback against that possibility. The issues of restoring civil liberties that the Netroots activists will tell you were taken away during the Bush years, where they see the Obama people either not acting quickly or not acting at all. To reverse that, they push back. They push back on issues of government transparency, where Obama promised in the campaign that he'd run an open government. When they want to know, who are you possibly cutting deals with? Are you cutting deals with the insurance companies? Are you cutting deals with the healthcare providers? Why won't you let us know who you're meeting with? You're going to see that kind of pushback by the Netroots. Some Netroots bloggers will contest that the president isn't doing enough to move on his promise to repeal the don't ask, don't tell policy. And there are others. It's a whole list of things where they don't agree with Obama, even though President Obama did effectively use the internet as a campaign tool during the campaign. I do not believe he's used the internet effectively as a governing tool, but I could talk about that during the question period if anyone's curious about it. Now, just as much as the Netroots object to the way democratic elites behave, just as strongly opposed to the way so much mainstream journalism is done. They regard conventional journalists as a kind of conventional wisdom machine made up of what they regard as conservative voices and the Democrats who appease them. They believe that objectivity, which is the hallmark of coverage in the mainstream press, can often generate a dishonest sense of false balance, which creates a news message that they feel is false. And it's sort of an interesting critique, because mainstream journalists will often put down bloggers as not being professional, they didn't go to journalism school, they don't know what they're talking about. But what you'll see on the left, the critique is, you know, there's a lot that's wrong with conventional journalism. They feel that what's wrong with conventional journalism holds them back because it makes it difficult for them to get a perspective to the public that they would argue is a more honest perspective, but it gets lost in the manufacturing of conventional wisdom and buried sometimes by a journalism of objectivity that they claim is really nothing but. In fact, sometimes they will claim that mainstream journalists are simply stenographers for elite interests. I'll give you an example. Probably no one has experienced the wrath of progressive bloggers. No journalist has felt their wrath more than Joe Klein, the columnist for Time magazine, who is commonly referred to as Joke Line on the internet. Let me give you a little example of why they're pushing back against conventional reporting. This is a quote. It's a couple of years old now. It's November of '07. And this occurred during the renewal of the FISA Act, that's the Surveillance Act. And Joe Klein, writing in Time magazine, incorrectly reported that the FISA bill, one of the amendments to the FISA bill being considered by Congress, would require court approval for surveillance of communications outside the United States. And Joe Klein blasted Democrats for supporting that measure. He called it, quote, well beyond stupid, and he said Democrats are, quote, mealy-mouthed on issues of national security. So, kind of like a shot across the bow. Well, Klein defended his reporting against some very scathing attacks in the Netroots. But then, after those attacks started to point out that a core fact at the heart of Klein's reporting was incorrect, Klein began to relent a little bit. And he said, well, okay, maybe I misread the legislation, but you know, it was really technical and all, and it was very difficult to know what it was really about. So Glenn Greenwald, who blogs at Salon.com, basically reprinted the relevant passage in the legislation, and that passage made it very clear, in plain English, that the legislation did not do what Klein said it would do, that in fact it said a court order was specifically not required for communications outside the United States. In other words, the claim that Klein had used to make the further claim that Democrats were mealy-mouthed and weak on security, that claim was false, and Greenwald printed as much in his blog at Salon. Greenwald's conclusion was that Klein never read the legislation. He never did his job. He got his information about it probably from a Republican source who had a personal interest in making Democrats look weak on national security. And then he reprinted what that source said. Well, that kind of stung. So Klein's editors at Time came back and they printed an addendum to Klein's original column. They didn't take it down. But what they did was they printed an addendum that said, well, the bill that Klein is talking about doesn't actually say what Klein said that it did, but that his mistake wasn't necessarily getting that wrong, but that he didn't quote a Democrat, that he left the false impression that everybody believed that this bill would require a court order for international surveillance, when in fact only Republicans believed that. So Klein amended his writing by saying, Republicans believe the legislation does it that way, but Democrats don't. To which Glenn Greenwald responded, Klein's so-called reporting error wasn't that he falsely described the bill. No, describing the bill accurately isn't the role of the journalist. Klein's only reporting error was that he only wrote down what one side said. He forgot to write down what the Democrats said. Now that the editors noted in passing that the Democrats disagree, everything is fixed. Their job is done. That's what they just said about as explicitly as it can be said. And they don't even realize that saying this is a profound indictment on what they do. They think that's what they're supposed to do. So the argument here is that false balance is an excuse for not doing real reporting. And some bloggers will contend that real reporting is exactly what they are after. That sometimes you can't balance one side with another side because that balance just doesn't hold up. They're partisan, but they tell you they're partisan. Really, one way of looking at what they do is to see them as a throwback to the press of Jackson's era. They are a throwback to the party press of the 19th century. They're openly partisan, but they would claim that open source reporting methods permit them to be fairly accurate, fairly robust. People will correct other people's mistakes in real time and very quickly. And they would contend that objectivity, the hallmark of mainstream reporting, is a value. It's a choice. It's not the only choice. It's not the only way we've done it. There was a long tradition of partisan journalism before the party press gave way to a commercial press that fostered objectivity. They would go back, in a way, to that earlier era. They would use 21st century technology in the service of 19th century politics and claim that what we would get in the end would be a more accurate telling of events. They would invite a conservative press, a conservative open source press, to do the same thing and have it out. Netroots activists seek a politics of community. So in addition to trying to win elections, in addition to trying to shape the way news is reported and framed, they also seek to generate a politics of community. If you look at the period of politics dominated by television, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and the 90s, even into the earlier part of this decade, it's a period characterized by apathy. It's a period characterized by cynicism, which is all too easy to blame exclusively on television, so I won't do that. But I will say that it's consistent with the way we use television as a medium. We use TV by lying on the sofa with a bucket of popcorn and a remote control in our hands. We don't like what we see, we change the channel. But we're passive, because it's a passive medium. We use the internet actively. We engage in the internet, and it engages us. If you've ever typed something in capital letters and someone came back and said, "Stop shouting," that's the internet. It's different. It doesn't invite disengagement, quite the opposite. It invites engagement. And there is evidence that the internet builds social capital through the development of virtual communities, and in some cases, real communities, and that we've seen that in the internet left, where virtual groups of activists have spilled over into the real world and engaged in political activism in 3 dimensions together. If the television era has been a divisive time, Netroots activists seek to change that through a politics of community that mirrors the communities that they're developing online. How successful will they be? Well, like I said, it's a lot. They're looking to elect officials who are responsive to their input, shape mainstream media narratives, build and nurture virtual and real communities. They've been moderately successful recruiting candidates, and the evidence of this is in my book if you're interested in more details. They've been very successful at mobilizing voters, raising money. They've been relatively unsuccessful in shaping the way media discusses politics outside of the internet. They've been extremely successful at building community. Now their goals are lofty, and I would really urge you to watch the healthcare bill and see how it comes out. If there's a public option in the final bill, then it is to no small degree because of their efforts to keep it alive and to push for it and to hold elected progressives' feet to the fire and make sure that they stand up for it. If they don't succeed, that too is a measure of how far they have to go. They say that they're willing to run primaries against entrenched Democrats who are not with them on things like the public option that really matter. We have to wait and see if they can do that and if they can do it successfully. That's something that establishment Democrats think is absolutely stupid. Why would you possibly run a primary challenge to a Democrat when you're probably going to make it more likely that a Republican's going to win, and that's going to undermine your numbers in Congress. To which Netroots activists would reply, why have the numbers in Congress if you're not going to implement progressive policies? That's the struggle for power that's going on right now. Now, in other periods of unrest, in other periods when the political parties have been unresponsive to important needs, in some other periods in our history, new coalitions have come along, new elites have formed, and they have successfully pushed out the old. We may be in a moment like that right now. We don't know. This is a work in progress. But we'll know soon. We'll probably know in the next few years. Because if they're successful, then these folks who organized online because they wanted to, because they chose to, will seek and probably will find a way to transform the way politics is done in this country. And with that, I'd be more than happy to take your questions. Anything?